Anthony Fauci rides off into the sunset. Florida Democrats face a consequential choice. Joe Biden might make you pay off somebody else's student debt after all. And look who's back running the Editors Podcast again this week. We'll discuss all of that and more on this edition of The Editors. Dear listeners, as you probably have noticed, I am not Rich Lowry. He's on vacation again. I'm Jim Garrity. Charlie Cook is here this week, but my butt has spot welded to the host seat, which means that much like Alexander Haig during the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, I am in control here. Charlie and I are joined by Alexandra, Queen of the Birds, DeSantis, and we have a full plate of topics ahead of us. This is the time of the podcast where Rich usually would remind you that if for some reason you're not already following the Editors Podcast on a streaming service, you can find us everywhere from Spotify to iTunes, and that we welcome your 5-star reviews. In fact, I noticed with pride a few of you just chose to give us a 5-star review after I mentioned it the last time that I hosted. So as usual with our reviews, go big or go home. Nobody wants to hear that you thought the show is just okay, 3 stars. Either give us 5 stars or don't bother. Our sponsor this episode is Quip toothbrushes, and you'll hear a bit more about them in a few minutes. But we begin with Anthony Fauci, President Biden's chief medical advisor and the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, who announced earlier this week he would end his career of more than 50 years in government public health work this coming December. Zan, I will not ask you, as Rich so often does, what do you make of it? I will instead ask you, what do you think about Anthony Fauci leaving government life?
Well, I think it's a good thing. I wish he had decided to leave a little bit sooner, frankly, given the way that he handled the COVID pandemic. He was in a position, I think, to use his influence well, to use his experience and expertise well, to reassure people, to try and craft public health guidelines that threaded the needle between, appropriate caution, not being too extreme on one end and not being too nonchalant on the other. And I think he squandered that. And certainly there was some room at the beginning of the pandemic for a lot of caution, perhaps more than in hindsight we actually needed, because there was a lot we didn't know about this virus. But he really, I think, enjoyed becoming a celebrity. And he enjoyed being the guy going out on the news shows and being asked whether we could visit with our family for the holidays and being asked whether Americans should go to the grocery store and, on and on down the list for several years. He just enjoyed all of that. And I think he allowed that to go to his head, and it damaged his judgment. And so I'm glad to see him go. I wish that he had handled everything a bit better. And I think most of his career, a lot of what he did probably was fine, but he's going to be remembered for, in my view at least, ought to be remembered for the things he did poorly.
Charlie, did your view of Anthony Fauci change over the course of the pandemic? And because I presume that it did, how did it change?
Oh, it certainly changed. If you go back to early episodes of The Editors, you'll hear me being pretty tolerant towards everyone. I was open to ideas. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'd never lived through an event like that. And Anthony Fauci was no exception to that rule. And I think at first, my line was, look, he has a role to play. That role is as expert. That role is as advisor. Politicians make decisions. Congress makes decisions. The president makes decisions. Governors, state legislatures make decisions. But we have to have people who are happy to put in their view to the mix. And I saw Anthony Fauci in that capacity. But of course, Anthony Fauci didn't see Anthony Fauci in that capacity. Anthony Fauci was totalized in his thinking. Anthony Fauci did not believe that his role was to play advisor, to play outside expert. He believed that his role was to take over. He did not believe. In fact, he does not believe. If you read interviews with him, recorded yesterday, last week, this month, that his role was to play advisor. He does not believe that this was a question of balancing different interests. He did not see two sides to the ledger. He didn't see any externalities. He didn't see any trade-offs. He thought and thinks that this was a matter of good and evil, of care and disdain, of science and irrationality, and it was no such thing. As became clear quite quickly, and this is abundantly obvious now. So yes, my perception of him changed dramatically. I started off thinking that it was good that we had people in government who had expertise and could contribute to the overall decision-making process. And I ended up seeing him as a totalitarian, as a perfect warning sign against Wilsonian progressivism. And I hope that it is for that latter contribution that he's remembered.
It will not surprise listeners to know that I agree with both of you largely. I think the American public was actually pretty darn patient and was actually pretty darn understanding of the fact that we were facing an unprecedented, unknown threat, that, you know, certain people who were elderly could catch COVID and seem to come through just fine. And there were some people who were significantly younger and who had one or two comorbidities who were dying from it early on. And this freaked people out. And I think a lot of people were willing to give expert figures and the faces of the response, like Anthony Fauci, a great deal of latitude early on. I think out of all the decisions Fauci made, I think the one that probably most drove the growing suspicion and the growing sense that he didn't understand the reality on the ground for those people who are being asked to lock down and stay indoors and minimize your interaction with others. Don't go any place you're not supposed to. Don't visit your elderly folks in retirement homes and things like that. I think the longer the pandemic wore on, and as things in America gradually started to open up, but we didn't reopen the public schools. If Anthony Fauci had been a full-throated supporter of reopening schools safely, and if he had been willing to tell the teachers' unions things they didn't want to hear, he was soft-spoken about this. And in fact, he very, very early on, he made some comments that kind of indicated that he felt like participating in the George Floyd protests was no more or no less safe than any other outdoor activity. I don't remember Anthony Fauci denouncing the guy down in Charlie's home state who was dressing up like the Grim Reaper, telling people that by going to the beach, they were risking their lives. There was a lot of crazy, overcautious panic that Fauci could have and should have pushed against. But I think the one that really stuck in people's craw is that there was a point in late 2020 when we had strip clubs open, but we didn't have public schools open. And I think anybody with a cup, a teaspoon of common sense would look at that and say that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. We have ended up with a public policy that prioritizes the needs of adults, but does not even consider the need for kids. And now we're dealing with not just the learning loss, but all kinds of issues, from depression to exacerbated substance abuse to, basically people who are dying of isolation during the course of the pandemic. And that is one of the consequences of this decision making. And the fact that Anthony Fauci kept coming around with, statements that basically sound, I am the science, did not win him any friends. I feel like celebrity brought out the worst in him. And it's a really unfortunate note to end what is indisputably a very illustrious career in medicine and public health. Kind of heading to the exit question, I'll start with you, Zan. How will Anthony Fauci be remembered?
I think there's a couple of layers here. I think he'll be remembered very poorly by people who came out of the pandemic feeling the way we do, feeling like it was right to be cautious for a time, but that, the CDC and other public health officials really bungled it in a lot of big ways and refused to admit it. I think he'll be remembered very poorly by those people. But I think he'll be remembered like, God, hero, saint, celebrity, martyr by people who think we should still be wearing masks in grocery stores and kids should still be masked in school. And those people exist. So I think he'll be glorified by people like that, derided by people like us. And I kind of think people in the middle, on the whole, are neutral, or, maybe think he did some things well and some things poorly, and won't have a strong feeling one way or another.
Charlie, how will Anthony Fauci be remembered?
I think there is real likelihood that Anthony Fauci will be remembered as the Robert McNamara of his era. As a guy who was fated by a certain sort of progressive, as the technocrat we need, as the person who cares only about reason and data, but who ended up presiding over a disaster. At least in McNamara's case, he quietly understood that the war in Vietnam was a disaster. I don't think Fauci does. I think his hubris is unchecked. And I suspect that when the history of this era is written and the trust in government and especially in public health officials is documented, Anthony Fauci will be the face of blame.
I largely concur. Again, I think fairly or not, Fauci will be remembered as the face of the lockdowns and the quarantines and the restrictions on Americans' lives, even though he was not actually the one implementing them. Very often it was governors like Gretchen Whitmer, Cuomo and Murphy in New Jersey and folks like that. I think he's going to be a much more controversial figure amongst the general public than his glowing media coverage would suggest. And I even think that even in some of the people who are currently in his fan base, we've seen how quickly the tides can turn for an Andrew Cuomo or a Chris Cuomo, or for not that long ago when Avenatti was the celebrity du jour. I think in a couple of years, somebody's going to be looking around in their closet and they're going to find the Anthony Fauci prayer candle. By the way, very few things bother me the way that does. I'm very laid back about that, but that is as sacrilegious as you get, or any other celebrity being put on a prayer candle. The Anthony Fauci action figure, yes, you can get them online. The Anthony Fauci merchandising, and I think people are going to look at that and say, what was that all about? Oh my God, he was a doctor. None of those decisions during the pandemic looked that great. So I don't think he will be that glowing figure that he is, at least in media circles right now. But what's perhaps most important, in all of Anthony Fauci's time in government, I don't know if he ever told you to brush your teeth. But good health starts with good habits, and that's where Quip comes in.
Nice.
Because, Quip makes it easy, delivering all of the oral care essentials you need to care for your mouth. The Quip electric toothbrush is loved by more than 7 million mouths. In fact, really 7 million whole people, not just the mouth part. And it's got timed sonic vibrations with 30-second pulses to guide a dentist-recommended 2-minute clean. It's got a lightweight and sleek design for both adults and kids with no wires, no bulky chargers to weigh you down. It comes with a multi-use travel cover that doubles as a mirror mount, so there's less clutter around your sink. And it's got reusable handles in a range of sleek metal hues, including best-selling all black and all pink, as well as bright plastic colors sure to make a pop in your bathroom counter. If you go to getquip.com/editors right now, you will get your first refill for free. That is your first refill free at getquip.com/editors. It is spelled G as in girl, E as in Ezra, T as in Thomas, Q as in quiet, U is the letter that always comes after Q, I as in Ichabod, P as in Peter.com/editors. Quip is the good habits company. All right, Charlie, Zan, as we are taping this, voters in New York, Oklahoma, and Charlie's home state of Florida are casting their ballots in the primaries. Florida Democrats are choosing who will take on Ron DeSantis, who is not related to Zan. In November, either the very familiar name of Charlie Crist or a young, aggressive, in-your-face progressive by the name of Nikki Fried. Charlie, you're down there. What are you seeing?
Well, it would be worth pointing out at the outset that for once, there is no drama whatsoever in the Republican primaries. Marco Rubio is running for Senate unopposed on the Republican side. Ron DeSantis is running for the governorship unopposed. And unlike in Arizona, unlike in Pennsylvania, unlike in Georgia, the Republican primary options at almost all levels, right down to county commissioner, are sensible, accomplished, electable. The Florida Republican Party really has got its act together. This occurred to me this morning. It's Election Day here issue say when I realized that I don't particularly care what happens on the Republican side, because this is not a party in disarray. So well done, Florida Republican Party. May you send emissaries to other states. The Democratic side, on the other hand, is a mess. And the Democratic Party has a bit of a problem in Florida. It's weak and it's disillusioned and demoralized and underfunded. But it's also, in some quarters, full of lunatics and grifters. For example, not too far from me, although on the other side of the state in the north, in the seat that was once held by Joe Scarborough, Rebecca Jones is running in the primary for the Democratic Party. Yes, that Rebecca Jones, the alleged felon, the fake whistleblower whose claims were dismantled by an Inspector General's report here in Florida. She wants to be the nominee there. And then for the governor's race, by far and away the most important race from my perspective, the two options are Charlie Crist, remember him? Guy who's been a Republican, an independent, and is now a Democrat. A guy who seems unable to live with himself, to love himself, to respect himself, unless he is running for office somewhere. A guy who ran for governor and won in 2006 as a Republican, who then lost as an independent against Rick Scott and seems likely to prevail in this primary race to face Ron DeSantis as a Democrat. And Nikki Fried, the marijuana-obsessed agriculture secretary, the only statewide elected Democrat in Florida, a candidate who won in a squeaker, who is extremely unlikely to win again in any circumstance, because she is probably the worst candidate I have ever seen. She is completely unhinged. She cannot avoid making cheap and irrelevant jokes, and her particular brand of hashtag resist politics just is not working in this state. I'm sure there are some circumstances in which it might work, but it just has not caught the mood of the Florida electorate. So I suspect that she will not be the Democratic nominee for governor. And if she is, by some miracle, the Democratic nominee for governor, she's going to lose in November.
So, Zan, after the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, the conventional wisdom in a lot of circles was that this was most going to benefit young, progressive, outspoken pro-choice candidates like Nikki Fried. And yet, based on the polling, I suppose something could really surprise us today. But the most recent one had Fried losing to Crist by 30 points. And what's more, she didn't get the endorsement of Emily's List or really any of the other big, prominent Democratic interest groups. So what do you think is going on here? And if it isn't working to Nikki Fried's benefit, what is the after effect of a decision like that from the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I think to the extent that Roe being overturned has any effect at all, it'll be much more of a, driving Democrats to turn out and vote for the Democratic candidate in the general election than it has a sorting effect in the Democratic primary. I assume I haven't followed the race nearly as closely as Charlie has in Florida in particular, but I assume all of the Democratic candidates are staunchly pro-abortion. And so I don't think that it makes much of a difference whether you're talking about it a lot or, just kind of casually say you didn't want Roe to be overturned and are pro-abortion. I think that's good enough for most Democratic voters. I'm not convinced even really that Roe having been overturned or that abortion in general is going to be that big of an issue in the midterms, let alone in primaries. I don't think most people vote on the abortion issue. I think people are pretty neatly sorted already, Democrat and Republican, on other issues that are more important to them. And that happens to align most likely with their views on abortion. Among people who vote with abortion as one of their top line issues, those people tend to tilt pro-life, but none of those people were changed one way or another by Roe having been overturned. They might be intensified a little bit, but anybody who's really angry about Roe having been overturned, I think, was already going to be voting Democrat, was already going to be showing up in November. So I don't think it really is going to make that much of a difference at all. Democrats have really been pushing this line. Pundits have been pushing this line. Jennifer Rubin wrote a column to this effect, I think, just last week. That Roe having been overturned is somehow going to save Democrats. I just don't think that's true. And I think, the longer we see after it was overturned, people are going to realize it didn't actually make anything worse from their perspective, right? Even though most Americans would not want the policy that I would prefer, which is, all unborn children protected from abortion. They didn't like the status quo under Roe. They thought they did because they didn't know what it was. But now that they're finding out Roe being overturned means that their state's going to decide its own abortion law, and probably they agree with it, I don't think many people are up in arms about it. So I think Democrats are really just saying this in the hopes that they can gin up some kind of base support. But I don't think it's going to manifest into anything major.
I think today's primary could well be more significant than a lot of people realize at this time. Charlie touched on this a little bit. I wrote about this in today's Morning Jolt. In Nikki Fried, you had the candidate who was basically running the Democratic resistance playbook that pretty much every Democrat in the country was running in the 2018 midterm cycle and in 2020. And all the way up to the point of explicitly comparing Ron DeSantis to Hitler. But this was how Democrats convinced themselves what they needed to do after the shock of the 2016 result. We need to get angry. We need to resist. We need to, just vent the spleen and let it all out. And, every conceivable hyperbolic, furious denunciation of Ron DeSantis that you can think of, Nikki Fried has tried. And really intriguingly, not only is this catapulting to her great success, and she's trailing by about 9 points, I think, in the Real Clear Politics average in her head-to-head matchups against Ron DeSantis. Charlie Crist is about 6 points behind by comparison. It's really not working in a Democratic primary. And I don't think it means that, Florida Democrats love Ron DeSantis or they intend to vote for Ron DeSantis. I think one of two things happen. One, either even Florida Democrats are tired of this. Even Florida Democrats don't find this compelling. They're exhausted by this. We've been hearing that Republicans are Nazis and Republicans are cuddling up with insurrectionists and Republicans are cuddling up with white supremacists and they're the worst. And not even Florida Democrats are all that interested in that message anymore. The other alternative is that maybe the average Florida Democrat grassroots voter does believe that, but they don't believe the electorate at large finds that a compelling message. As Charlie laid out, Charlie Crist is as the good Charlie on this podcast laid out. The bad Charlie down in Florida, Charlie Crist, is a very familiar name, very familiar face. And he has always stood for one really important, clear, upstanding principle. And that principle is that Charlie Crist should be the governor of the state. Everything else is negotiable. Everything else can change. A couple of years back, I had imagined the Charlie Crist of 2010 running against the Charlie Crist of 2014 and the kind of debate that they would have. I should have added the Charlie Crist of 2022 because now you've got the allegedly conservative, the allegedly moderate and independent, and the allegedly progressive Charlie Crist all disagreeing with each other on things. If you don't like Charlie Crist's principles, don't worry, he's got other ones that he can offer you. I think if Crist wins, and the last poll had him up by like 30, I think it's a demonstration that the resistance politics that were very effective against Trump, against a whole bunch of Republicans in 2018 and 2020, aren't working against Ron DeSantis. And if you're thinking about the Republican choice in 2024, take the lessons from that as you like. But I think it's a very interesting demonstration that Ron DeSantis is looking like he's on pace to win in a state that, he barely won 4 years ago. Rick Scott barely won 4 years before that and 4 years before that. It's been a red state, but it hasn't been a solidly red state. And it looks like Ron DeSantis is on course to win pretty handily. Take the lessons from that. So exit question, first to you, Charlie. Very easy one for the first part, less easy for the second part. Who's going to win the governor's race in November? And because I think I know the answer to that one, what do you think the margin's going to be?
I think Ron DeSantis is going to win the governor's race in November. I haven't got carried away in the way others have with the margin. Ron DeSantis, when he came in, was extremely popular. I think he had before COVID a 70 to 75% approval rating. COVID created controversies, and the controversies created division, and DeSantis took a brave line, a line most governors didn't. The consequence of that, though, was that his decisions and his approach became nationalized and sucked in to our partisan whirlwind. And as such, he is seen as a controversial figure. And I think that he's going to keep down his margins. I would say he'll win by between 3 and 5. I think if he wins by 7, he will have made a remarkable case that he should be the Republican nominee in 2024. 3 to 5 would be good. But it's Florida, Jim, and we are used to squeakers here. So there's no guarantee that it won't be close.
Alexandra DeSantis, who is going to win the governor's race in Florida, and what's the margin going to be?
I think DeSantis. I mean, I'd be shocked if DeSantis didn't win. And Charlie's the real expert here, so I am hesitant to disagree. I think the margin will be bigger, bigger than 5. That would be my guess.
So I had thought I was going to go into this being a less enthusiastic supporter of DeSantis than Charlie is. Charlie putting in that 3 to 5 range makes me a little bit nervous because I had written in my notes about 8 points, which now looks wildly optimistic compared to.
I'm an outlier here, by the way. That guess is much more in line with what you'll hear from people here.
Okay. My sense is that particularly as it, if I suspect that once I suspect Christ will be the nominee. I suspect DeSantis will have a consistent lead for much of September, October, and I think it'll become pretty clear momentum and things like that. There'll be a bandwagon effect. Last time around, DeSantis scored about 4 percentage points higher than his final average in the Real Clear Politics one. He's currently ahead by about 6, so I'm figuring he'll do a little bit better than that, and I put him in around 8 points. Maybe I'm being wildly over optimistic and somebody will do that. But by my standard, yeah, I think if you win Florida by 8 points, you definitely should be getting serious consideration by Republicans nationally. All right, that wraps up the issue of Florida. But I saved this topic for last because I wanted this special edition of The Editors to climax with the sound of Charlie Cook's head exploding. August 31st is approaching, and President Biden said that by then he would reach a decision on whether to forgive student loan debt. The latest report is that Biden will cancel $10,000 in debt for those making less than $125,000 per year. Zan, you and I should back up because Charlie may well spontaneously combust upon hearing this news. Charlie, I'm just going to press on that giant exposed nerve and watch you go. What do you think of this upcoming decision from President Biden?
It's everything I hate. It's illegal executive overreach. It's the abolition of the English language. It's class war from the clerisy. It's inflationary. And it's irrational. It's illegal because the president doesn't have the authority to do this. Nowhere in the law does it say that the president can cancel, by which we mean transfer, I'll come on to that in a moment, student debt. The Department of Education found this a year and a half ago when it looked into the matter. And that conservative firebrand Nancy Pelosi concurred and said to a journalist that the president doesn't have the authority to do this and that this was a non-issue as a result. It's the abolition of language because you cannot cancel debts that have already been incurred and spent and from which people have benefited. There's no cancellation here. It's a transference away from the people who took out the money, who spent the money, who benefited from the money, who have the certificate as a result, and toward the people who did not do those things, toward the people who did something else, who made different calls. It is an attack by the clerisy on more than half of the country because it is predicated upon the idea that it is so useful to have people going to college, that is so good for America when they do, that any debt must be seen as a problem, as a mistake, and that taxpayers in general must be recruited to pay it off. So let's suppose you have brothers. Call one James, the other one William. And James decides that he wants to go to college. So he takes $50,000 out in loans and he does a degree. And the other brother says, no, I don't want to do that. Instead, I want to be a plumber. So he does an apprenticeship and he buys a Ford F-150 or a van. He takes out $50,000 in loans to start his business. And one day, the president of the United States, with no congressional authority, comes along and says that one of those people gets $10,000 from the government. His loan is reduced. He logs in to his portal, and where it once said 50, it says 40. Where it once said 30, it says 20. But not the other brother. No, not the other brother. He might work hard. He might be an excellent plumber. He will have taken out a loan at a higher rate, of course, than the student. He logs in, he sees nothing, and worse, he has to pay for his brother. And if he doesn't pay directly in taxes, the debt in his name is grown. And the inflation that the decision causes in his name hurts him. This is a disgrace. It is an irrational disgrace. And it is irrational because it's not part of any broad movement. Now, I would oppose it. I don't believe that we should be running around running executive debt jubilees. But if you are Bernie Sanders and your view is that education should be entirely public, that the university should be an extension of the state, that it is immoral, wrong to have a private system, to have loans at all, okay, then do reform. Nationalize the university. Provide upfront taxpayer assistance. Then, once you've done that, once you've made your reforms, cancel, i.e. transfer, some of the debt. But that's not what's happening. This is a lightning bolt. It's a snapshot in time. So Biden, at the end of August, says, okay, $10,000 gone. Congratulations, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You've reduced your burden by $10,000. Then what? The next day, somebody goes into an office and fills out student loan application forms. They don't get that. What about the people who paid off their loans the day before? What happens to tuition? What happens to enrollment numbers? Nothing. There is no plan. There is no joined up thinking. There is no agenda. There is just a one-time jubilee. And why? Because people around the president, self-serving, selfish, privileged people, want this. And because Joe Biden is in political trouble, his approval rating is 40% or under, and there is a midterm election coming up in 2 or 3 months. It's a disgrace. And I will finish by saying that if Biden does it, the Republican Party needs to throw the kitchen sink at him. It needs to start by suing him. If it can't sue him, it needs to impeach him if it wins the midterms. And beyond that, it needs to end the student loan program so that this can't happen again. I'm not wild about the student loan program in the first place, but if we're going to have one, we have to have a guarantee that the people who have made promises will be held to those promises. If we don't have that guarantee, then it has to go. It is profoundly unfair to leave the rest of us out here wondering whether or not we will suddenly, by the stroke of a pen, the whim of a president, be on the hook for hundreds of billions of dollars.
Listeners, have you noticed that Charlie Cook gets more eloquent when he's angry? Don't make him angry. You wouldn't like him when he's angry. Zan, it is not easy to follow up on that tour de force, but I just want to get your sense of how this issue is going to play out. And one of the things I'm kind of wondering about is whether some of Biden's decision, or whether some of the folks around Biden are thinking, well, we're probably going to get wiped out in the midterms anyway, so we might as well do something to please our base. Do you think that thinking is at work here, or is it a mystery as to what kind of thinking, if any, is going on inside the head of Joe Biden?
Well, I don't know who can really say what's going on inside Joe Biden's head, but I think Charlie is right to note that people around Biden want this. And he's right to use the word privileged, because I think the Biden administration is talking about this, and people who support this are talking about it as though it's some kind of, remedy or assistance to, poor people almost, or needy people, when in fact it's assistance to people who have college degrees, who are able to go to college and already have a leg up on plenty of Americans. So the idea that this is some kind of, assistance to people in need is crazy. It's really just a bailout of people who probably could pay back their student loans, and people who already are very privileged when we take a look at kind of the population as a whole. So I think it's very silly. They're trying to get away with pitching this as some kind of, charitable gesture that they can just wave a pen and accomplish this and help people who really need help. They're not helping people who really need help. And they're doing it at the expense of everybody else, including people who are less well off than the people who haven't yet paid back their student loans. And I would just add one point. I agree with Charlie. I think the student loan program is silly to begin with. And I don't understand why so few people refuse to acknowledge that, because the system functions the way that it does, because we have the government, with these different grants and loan programs underwriting people's college educations, these institutions are raising the cost, right? The fact that it's subsidized by the government essentially allows colleges and universities to make it more and more and more expensive. And it's a totally inflated bubble at this point. And it's no wonder that more people are wondering whether it's worth getting a college degree at all, given the prices and given what you're getting at most of these institutions. It's not worth it. And so I think we honestly would be much better off, especially if it's going to end up with things like this happening randomly and with no way of stopping it. We'd be better off just getting rid of the program entirely.
So, unsurprisingly, I agree a great deal with both of what both of you laid out. I also, Zan just used the term bubble and idea of the concepts of higher education. And I think we're seeing here is the effects of another bubble, that there is a bubble of who Joe Biden talks to and who the people who Joe Biden talks to talk to. And the overwhelming majority of those people either have student loans, debt that they themselves would like to see relieved and like to get basically a $10,000 gift from the government, or they know people who do, or they're wealthy enough that they don't care and that they don't see this as some sort of effort to, robbing Peter to pay Paul or something like that. I think the kinds of people who'd be most bothered by this, who would feel like they're effectively paying for the, college educations and graduate school educations of other people, they don't have a voice in this White House. They don't have a voice in this administration. They don't have a voice amongst Democrats in Congress. The Democrats have largely become the party of college educated elites, and the Republicans have become the party of non-college educated blue collar working class folks, with one glaring exception. And that is former Treasury Secretary and Harvard President Larry Summers, who took to Twitter earlier this week and said he thought this was a bad idea. I mentioned this to Charlie earlier in the week, and Charlie expressed the fear that Summers had heard something, and then within a day or two, we heard this report that Biden was strongly expected to support $10,000 in debt relief for those making $125,000 a year or less. Now, listeners with long memories may remember Larry Summers. Wait a second. Wasn't he the guy who was warning Democrats the American Recovery Act was going to set off an inflationary spiral? Why, yes, he is. He's the exact same guy. So here we are in another, not entirely perfectly the same, but quite similar set of circumstances, which Democrats are contemplating doing something that amounts to a giant spending bill, or in this case, taking on additional debt to the government. And Larry Summers is saying, oh, don't do that. He seems like the poor person in the audience at a horror movie saying, don't go in there. Larry Summers right now is the lone struggling designated driver at a party where everyone is drunk. And he's like, look out for that tree. No, don't get behind the wheel. He's trying and he's trying. And they never seem to listen to him, no matter how many times he is right. And no matter how severe the consequences of him being right are, like the inflationary spiral that we have experienced for so much of this year. So I think we are, destined to repeat history. I think this is because there's basically no one else at the table other than Larry Summers to tell Biden and to tell everybody else, no, this is a bad idea. This is going to make things worse. This is going to throw more gasoline on the inflationary fire. And oh, by the way, this looks like you're basically rewarding people who you personally know and the class that you inhabit at the expense of everyone else. I think it's going to be disastrous. But I think that's my exit question to both of you, starting with Charlie. Will Biden's decision help him or hurt Democrats in November?
Oh, I think it's going to hurt him. I think he is blind to the political consequences of this. I think all he can see is handing out money to young people. But if you read accounts of the debate within the White House, the vast majority of his advisors seem to intuit that this is madness, but apparently to no avail.
Zan DeSantis, is this going to be a winner or a loser in November for the Democrats?
I think it'll be a loser. They might get some help. I think a lot of media outlets are going to try and spin it as being a lot more justifiable and, try to spin away the negative consequences of it. And that might help alleviate it a little bit or soften the blow, at least in the short term. But I think on the whole, the number of people he's trying to please is few enough, and probably people who already would support him, or it's just kind of negligible to most people. And then there's a lot of people who are going to find it very outrageous. And so I think on the whole, it'll hurt him.
Yeah, I think Biden's going to do this. I think Democrats in Congress are largely going to cheer it, and it'll get glowing coverage from the media, and they will look at their poll numbers and wait for that nice little bump from this decision. And it won't arrive because everybody who is benefiting was already voting for Democrats. This is not actually going to be a big help. It's actually going to give a lot of Republicans one more area of populist attack. You don't have to be a MAGA hat wearing Trumper to look at this and say, this is a bad idea. This ends up rewarding some citizens and punishing others. This is rewarding irresponsibility and does nothing to contain college costs. This will not work well for the Democrats, but I think we are now at a state where it's almost like a fire sale. They can read the writing on the wall. They're not going to have the House after January 3rd, and they might as well pass everything they can while they've still got control of the House and Senate. All right, that's a grim note, but now we're going to move on to lighter items. And I noticed that Alexandra DeSantis did not tout her choice on Twitter this time, which generally generates a great deal of excitement and anticipation. Zan, I am guessing that sometime in the last week or two, you went to some place that had a name like Bergberg.
I wish I had, but actually we have not traveled at all really in the last month or so, which has been nice. And so sadly, my light item this week is another food related item. I had the amazing pickle recipe last week, and I hope some of our listeners tried it out. This week, I have another recipe, and it is for, I kid you not, the best pancakes I've ever had. They are homemade. It's from a cookbook called The Food Lab, which is an awesome cookbook, just worth checking out on its own. But the pancake recipe in particular, I have eaten a lot of pancakes in my day at a lot of diners, and many of them are excellent, but nothing yet topped these. So got to check it out.
All right. Charlie, I'm going to guess that your lighter item involves either a roller coaster, a firearm, or your kids. Or my most likely choice is that your kids have learned about gun safety while riding a roller coaster.
No, mine is actually not a light item. It's a lightning item.
Ah!
Because while I was away in Nevada last week, we had the mother of all storms. I mean, this storm was bad enough that people who live near me were texting me saying, is this the end times? As if I would know, all people. Apparently, it was so bright from all the lightning strikes around the house that if you looked out of the window, you could barely see. And one of these lightning strikes, unfortunately, hit very, very close to my house. I didn't hit my house, which would have been the ultimate disaster, but it hit close to my house, and it caused what I'm told is an overvoltage surge, which did not come into the house via the power sockets. So score one for me. I have managed to surge protect things well enough, but did, unfortunately, come into the house via the coaxial cable that provides the internet, and fried my modem, and then moved up through the Ethernet cables into my patch bay and wreaked absolute havoc all around the house. As I've probably noted before, have a smart home, and a lot of things are wired in, and a lot of things that were wired in are now black and charred and not working. So it's not a light item in the sense that it is light. It's not a light item in the sense that it is happy or even funny. But I think it is interesting, which is, let's put it nicely, Jim, not the word that I chose when I first learned about the damage.
I was going to say, Charlie, on this podcast, have you ever said, if something isn't true, may I be struck by lightning?
I don't think so. I certainly won't be saying that in the future.
So it does feel a little unfortunate, ironic, now that we know that gathering storms are what intimidate and upset and frighten Charlie the most, that today is publication day for my new thriller novel entitled Gathering Five Storms. Relax, Charlie, it does not have that many.
Your fault.
Yeah, it's not actual physical thunderstorms in the book. This is a thing I've done on the side for fun for the last couple of years. It is more than a little bit cathartic to just let out everything through fiction writing. If you've bought the other books and enjoyed them, great. If you have not, please check it out on Amazon. I wrote a short story called Saving the Devil. It's a little tapas serving of this. It's only 99 cents. If you're like, I like Jim, but I don't know if I like these thriller novels, try that. If you like it, great, go into it. Gathering Five Storms takes my characters and they find out that someone has been, just as they feel like their lives have gotten together, they're a small covert team run by the CIA. Someone's out to kill them because of something they did on their first mission back in 2003 as the Iraq War was about to begin. And oh, by the way, they're pretty sure everyone they fought back on that mission is dead. So are they being chased by a zombie? Are they being chased by a ghost? Or has somebody noticed that, consequential first mission? Check it out. Enjoy it. I hope everybody has a good time with it. And yes, someday I will stop nagging people to check it out. All right, on to our editor's picks, and I will start with you, Zan.
So my pick is Kevin Williamson's newsletter this week. It's called The Tuesday, and this week's edition is called Abortion Facts Precede Abortion Law. Kevin's newsletter is always worth reading. I believe you have to be an NR Plus subscriber to receive the newsletter, to read the newsletter now. So certainly subscribe because it's always wonderful. But this week in particular, I think is a great one.
Charlie, your editor's pick.
Is you, Jim. Is your piece from this morning, the Morning Jolt. The resistance playbook fails Democrats in Florida. We talked about this a little bit earlier, so I won't reiterate all of the points I made and you have made. But I would just say something that we didn't address, and that's that it's one thing to run around saying this person is like Hitler, this person is like Stalin, this person is like a dictator in, say, Michigan. It's another to do it in Florida, where a lot of people who have fled dictators live. People from Cuba, people from Venezuela, people from Colombia. And I think you had a great rundown here of why this playbook, which is not for the reason I just outlined, but why this playbook hasn't worked. Because for that reason, and among others, Florida is different. And at some point, the Democrats are going to notice this. But as you point out, they haven't noticed it yet. And it's particularly heartbreaking for them, as you say, that they haven't noticed. Because a few years ago, they were pretty convinced that it would soon swing into their column thanks to the high Hispanic population.
Oh, thank you, Charlie. For my selection, I really like Jack Butler's piece entitled Biden's Historians Hurt America and Dishonor Their Profession. You may have heard about how the likes of John Meacham and Michael Beschloss and Doris Kearns Goodwin are basically become de facto Biden advisors. He brings them in pretty regularly. And Jack argues they've kind of abused their status as historians by now whispering in Biden's ear. First, they told him that he could be the next FDR or LBJ. And if reports are to be believed, now this crew is telling Biden that he could be the next Abraham Lincoln by winning another civil war. That doesn't sound ominous. So check it out. Worth reading. But everything on National Review is worth reading. That's it for this edition. Rich would usually tell you at this time that any rebroadcast, retransmission, or account of this game without the express written consent of Major League Baseball is prohibited. But you know what I say? you go ahead and dare Rob Manfred to stop you. This podcast has been produced by the incomparable Sarah Schutte, who makes us sound better than we deserve and edits the Morning Jolt most mornings, which I often send to her by carrier pigeon and written on parchment in a quill pen. I am Jim Garrity, and I'll see you next time, if there is a next time.